A Tender Moment, a Darcy and Elizabeth short story. Darcy and Elizabeth Short Stories, Book 3. Written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Pearl Hewitt. Part 1. Something So Wrong. Elizabeth gazed in astonishment at the size of the party assembled at Sir William Lucas's that evening. As Lucas Lodge neighboured her father's estate, Longbourn Village, Elizabeth and all her sisters attended. In fact, everyone who was anyone in the town of Meryton and its surrounding villages was there, for this was yet another occasion to better his or her acquaintance with Mr. Charles Bingley. The young man had recently let Netherfield Park. Handsome and exceedingly agreeable, he was a single gentleman from the north of England who happened to be in possession of a rather large fortune. Indeed, he and his party, his friend Mr. Darcy of Pemberley in Derbyshire, who was far richer and the far more handsome of the two, Bingley's eldest sister Louisa, her husband Mr. Hurst, and Bingley's sister Caroline, had garnered everyone's curiosity from near and far. With varying degrees of enthusiasm, the Bennet daughters had looked forward to the evening. For one, it promised the youngest daughters the possibility of such merriment with the officers of the militia that had recently encamped outside of Meryton. Miss Mary Bennet, who, in consequence of being the only plain one in the family, worked hard for knowledge and accomplishments, always welcomed such occasions as another chance to display her talent. Elizabeth's eldest sister Jane, though she would never confess it, was particularly keen on seeing her Mr. Bingley, as those closest to Jane had begun referring to him. Although Jane had known him only a fortnight, her times with him were the making of some of the happiest memories of her life. She danced 4 dances with him at Meryton. That alone sufficed to excite her eager mamma's hopes. She saw him one morning at his house when the ladies of Longbourn waited on those of Netherfield, and had since dined with him in company 4 times. Though hardly enough time for her to understand his true character, it was enough to give rise to talk of a pending and most advantageous alliance. The promise of seeing her dearest sister's delight in being once again in Mr. Bingley's company was enough to cause Elizabeth to anticipate the evening with pleasure. How Elizabeth's heart sang, merely recalling her sister's praise of the young man, and their mutual agreement that he was indeed everything a gentleman ought to be. If only I might say the same of his friend, Mr. Darcy. Just as she did whenever she allowed her thoughts to wander from her sister's future felicity to the disagreeable Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth silently chastised herself. To say that the man vexed her at every turn was putting it mildly. Rarely had he spoken a few words to her since first meeting her, when he failed to coat his sentiments with condescension and thinly disguised disdain. Why does he even bother speaking with me at all if he only means to be unpleasant and dismissive? Then, too, were the disquieting bevy of sensations that flooded her being whenever she and the haughty gentleman had the misfortune of being in close proximity. Be it sitting next to each other in a crowded room, the incidental brush of either of their arms against the other's, or the touch of his hand when he deigned to greet her with a modicum of civility. Such dizzying sensations are a consequence of our mutual dislike of each other, no doubt. Elizabeth reminded herself of said reasoning regularly of late. Not giving much thought to where she was going, Elizabeth soon found herself directly behind Mr. Darcy and Miss Caroline Bingley. In consequence of being so close to the last 2 people in the room she wanted to speak to, she overheard him remark that he would sooner call Mrs. Bennet a wit. How dare he level such an insult? Elizabeth was livid, and for good reason. The woman of whom he was speaking was her mother. Despite hearing only the end of his speech, and thus having no basis of understanding as to the true extent of his offence, such an affront was unwarranted, and would not go unchallenged. Besides, if she said nothing and rather pretended she did not hear his unkind remark to Miss Bingley, the proud man might begin to suspect she was afraid of him. Elizabeth approached the couple and directed her ire towards the gentleman. "How dare you speak so callously about my mother? You know nothing about her." Standing there with an air that proved him wholly unmoved by any feeling of remorse, Darcy said, "I know enough about her to know that she failed to teach you proper decorum. How dare you remark on a conversation clearly not intended for your hearing?" The second eldest daughter, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, was fiercely loyal to her family and friends. It was not that others had not disparaged her mother. Elizabeth's father, Mr. Thomas Bennet, who was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humour, reserve and caprice, prided himself on his want of making light of his dear wife's deficit of sensibilities, and often derided all his daughters as being the silliest women in all of England. However, it was different with family. A family's liberty always trumped a stranger's prerogative. Ignoring the amusement stamped upon Miss Bingley's face, Elizabeth erased the distance between Darcy and herself. Her argument was not with the silly creature who was supercilious in her treatment of everyone, but with the gentleman who fancied himself above his company. She strained her neck upward in order to look him straight in his haughty face. She balled her hands by her sides and raised her voice. "Perhaps if you were not so inclined to think meanly of others in comparison with yourself, you would have apologized to me for your poorly chosen words rather than chastise, more accurately, further insult me, Mr. Darcy." Unwilling to concede his point, he folded his arms over his broad chest and laced his voice with cool civility. "What did I say that is untrue?" "This has nothing to do with truth, sir, and everything to do with decency. Not everyone has all your advantages, your wealth and status. I dare say not everyone wants them, especially seeing that they have done nothing to make you a better man. A true gentleman would never utter such unkind words about those who are less fortunate than himself, nor would he look down upon others merely due to the circumstances of their birth." "You know nothing about me, young lady, and for you to assume otherwise reflects a fair amount of presumption on your part, does it not?" "Presumption, perhaps, but I know enough about people of your ilk to be certain that I speak the truth, whereas you, sir, will not be bothered to know anyone whom you deem beneath you in consequence." "How does that explain my standing here conversing with you?" "On the contrary, sir, we are not conversing, we are arguing. You would know the difference were you a true gentleman. But as you are not, I find it beneath me to carry on with you in this manner for a second longer." Turning hastily, Elizabeth stormed off, leaving Darcy standing there, his mouth agape. Offending Miss Elizabeth Bennet was the last thing he wanted to do, and yet he had managed to do it again. "Ever since I arrived at this place, the notion of seeing her is what gives me hope each day." Yet every time he opened his mouth around her, the words that fell out only served to annoy rather than enamour her. At first he had thought it was stimulating, the verbal repartee, her witty responses, her teasing wit, and the teasing turn of her lips and spark in her eye, all with a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner that made it difficult for her to affront anybody. However, their latest exchange was decidedly different. The teasing turn of her lips had taken on the shape of a definite grimace, and the spark in her eye had borne the unmistakable flash of disdain. Thoughts of just where he had gone wrong accompanied him to the terrace, where he leaned against the railing. "Will I ever learn? It is better to say nothing at all than to say something that puts me further at odds with her, or to utter something idiotic just for the sake of conversation. I've grown quite accustomed to fending off women, but I have no wish to do that with her. She is quite unlike any woman I've ever known." This was always happening to him, a consequence of being hopelessly drawn to her, but afraid of what would truly happen should he allow himself to get too close. His nights of late had found him falling asleep with aching thoughts of her light, pleasing figure, and awakening each morning with the throbbing hope that soon he would be admiring her remarkably fine eyes, utterly and completely lost in their expression. Still endeavouring to sort through what had just happened with the bewitching young woman, Darcy turned and gripped the rail. Why is it that I always manage to say the wrong thing to her? It is no wonder she does not bestow her smiles as willingly upon me as she does towards the other gentlemen of her acquaintance. Darcy folded one arm over the other and stood tall and proud. I do not often find myself in such a state. No one had ever levelled such egregious accusations against him. She said he was no gentleman, arguing it takes more than wealth and status to deserve the word, and a true gentleman would never utter such unkind words about those who are less fortunate than he is, or look down upon others merely due to the circumstances of their birth. What am I doing? Indeed, a wealthy gentleman of 27, he had lived his adult life fending off the advances of young ladies whose interest in him he attributed primarily to his wealth. Not that he was successful. His carefully donned mask of indifference they interpreted as mysterious. His condescension and disdain they interpreted as commendable. On the other hand, did they? Maybe the prospect of being the next mistress of Pemberley was enough that they would suffer any manner of obstacles he erected before them. Miss Elizabeth Bennet, on the other hand, was quite unlike any woman he had ever known. She pierced his armour without even trying, and considering her attitude, apparently without even wanting to. It was true that Darcy had spent the past weeks trying to deny it made a difference what Miss Elizabeth thought of him. Who was she in comparison with him? Even if he secretly admired her charms and her amazing eyes, she was too far below him in consequence for any serious consideration. The last thing he ever wished to be accused of was raising her expectations, he reminded himself. Bingley has already given rise to talk of Elizabeth's eldest sister, Miss Jane Bennet, being the future mistress of Netherfield. The last thing in the world Darcy wanted to do was stoke the flames of speculation that he, too, was taken by one of the Bennet daughters. One did not simply dally with a gently bred woman. Any interest, any long looks, any show of kindness was pretty much regarded as a proposal of marriage in such a small town, especially coming from a single man with a large fortune. Darcy drew a long breath of the warm night's fresh air. Other than myself, whom am I fooling? Shaking his head, he recalled his purposes for the evening. He had counted the hours to this evening, as all those who espied the alacrity with which he consulted his pocket-watch would attest to. This was meant to be the evening he would lower his guard in her presence and encourage her to reciprocate in kind, the evening he would make amends for not dancing with her at the Meryton assembly when they first made each other's acquaintance, as well as any other slights since then. His mind wandered to when he had purposely sought her company earlier that evening. As she was conversing with her friend, Miss Lucas, Darcy contented himself with admiring her rather than joining the ladies. How her eyes sparkled, and what great energy she exhibited when teasing the head of the local militia, Colonel Foster, to give a ball at Meryton. He'd been standing close enough to appreciate the sweet smell of Elizabeth's perfume, the fragrance of rose petals, which he would associate with her alone forevermore. That was before Miss Bingley found him and dragged him away, ostensibly for the purposes of having someone by her side among a crowded room of strangers. What a difference there was between the two young women. Miss Bingley he'd learned to tolerate solely for the sake of his friendship with her brother Charles. In truth, he often found her rather unpleasant, despite her habit of hanging on to his every word. Miss Elizabeth, on the other hand, had an uncanny propensity wilfully to misunderstand his every word, or so it seemed. Perhaps I should leave things as they are. Having never felt this way for any woman, he commenced wondering what becomes of an attraction denied. Do such feelings as these dissipate with time, or merely recreate themselves as unrelenting anguish over what might have been? Miss Elizabeth Bennet. The prospect of leaving things as they were with her did not sit well with him. Even if he were uncertain whether a meaningful future with her was a possibility, he was sure he wanted her good opinion. For reasons he had yet to comprehend fully, earning her good opinion was everything. Perhaps it had to do with that very thing that threatened to keep them apart and made a real future between them an impossibility: her loyalty and strong defence of her family. Darcy's own family situation left him wanting. His mother had died when he was little more than a child and too young to comprehend that it was not abandonment. Of course she did not abandon him, but tell that to a boy whose world felt rendered upside down. Bereft of a mother's love, and not fully grasping the dispassion inherent in the care of a grieving father, Darcy did not have a strong and lasting impression of what it was like to be loved unconditionally. Owing to his wealth and standing, his views were fashioned by a general expectation of love and affections with strings attached. Now, for the first time in his life, he had met a woman who wanted nothing from him, yet he was drawn to her. Somehow, he had to make things right. Tired of berating himself and not content to leave things as he had, he set off to make amends. Part 2. Not How I Feel. Darcy caught Elizabeth completely off guard when he asked if he might have the pleasure of dancing with her at some point during the evening. Her eyes opened wide. "If I say no, then I will be obliged to forego any other requests the rest of the evening. For once a lady denies a gentleman's request to dance, she has no choice but to decline all subsequent entreaties. To do otherwise surely would be fodder for gossip and ridicule. I do not wish to watch everyone else make merriment. I want my share of excitement. Oh, you selfish, selfish man! How dare you put me in this position?" Elizabeth uttered the only thing she could in such a situation as this. "Yes, you may." Darcy bowed, she curtsied, and he soon disappeared into the crowd gathered across the room. Needing time to fret over what had just happened, Elizabeth headed out the double French doors to take in the night air. "What is he thinking in asking me to dance, given the manner of our separation just half an hour ago? Does he mean to torment me? Did he expect me to say no, knowing that if I did, he would have the satisfaction of watching me forego the pleasure of dancing with other gentlemen who are not so wealthy as he is? Certainly not so handsome, but who are far more kind and considerate." Having been the one who was standing next to Elizabeth when Mr. Darcy approached them and requested the next set, Elizabeth's intimate friend Charlotte Lucas found Elizabeth standing alone outside. She tried her best to console Elizabeth. "Take heart, dearest Eliza. For what it's worth, you did the right thing in accepting Mr. Darcy's petition." "As though I had a choice in the matter," said Elizabeth. "No doubt the sole reason he asked is because he was hoping I would say no, thus ruining what's left of my evening." Had it not been for her friends opening the instrument in the first place and prevailing upon Elizabeth to perform, perhaps her sister Mary might not have succeeded her and commenced a long concerto. Subsequently, at the request of her younger sisters, Mary had been persuaded to play something conducive to dancing. Some of Charlotte's family and 2 or 3 officers eagerly joined them in dancing. Elizabeth had seen in Mr. Darcy, who stood near them, the silent indignation at such a mode of passing the evening, and yet he had prevailed upon her to stand opposite him. A kind, unpretentious woman, Charlotte shook her head. "I don't suppose that was his reason at all." "Do you have a better explanation?" "It seems you are handsome enough to tempt the gentleman after all." "Oh, Charlotte, how can you make light of my situation? Had the insufferable man arrived mere moments earlier, he would have heard my complaints against him for his latest offence." "Oh, dearest Eliza, can you not see how much he likes you? While one may rightfully accuse him of sometimes saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, One must suppose that is his way. If you would but give him a chance, I dare say you will find him very agreeable." Charlotte and Jane were always endeavouring to give Mr. Darcy the benefit of the doubt, tilted in favour of his goodness by virtue of his friendship with Mr. Bingley. "I know better." "I dare say you are no friend at all, even to wish such a fate upon me." Miss Elizabeth could not possibly have known that she and her friend were not alone on the terrace. Wishing to escape Miss Bingley's annoying habit of deriding his inclination of admiring Elizabeth, as well as her repeated taunts of wishing him joy in his would-be marriage, Darcy sought the solace of the night air while awaiting the next set. He would not have been the least bit surprised were it Miss Bingley whom Elizabeth was speaking of with Miss Lucas. Bingley's sister was always rude and condescending towards everyone, especially the Bennets. Waves of trepidation tinged with a hint of remorse washed over him. "Is that how Miss Elizabeth regards me as well?" Standing in the shadows, Darcy stared into the distance. The moon that had shone so bright earlier that evening now barely peeped beyond the clouds. Her opinion of him was even lower than he had supposed. He had no idea that he had made such a horrible impression upon her. Her grievances against him started long before that night, and he had no one to blame but himself. "Perchance she overheard what I said to Bingley that evening at the Meryton assembly. I didn't mean a word of it." Since then, whenever they were in company, either he was too taciturn and aloof with her, or he was fumbling for something to say, and never just himself. "It's truly a wonder she even agreed to dance with me at all." Darcy knew what he must do. "Soon I will claim her hand for the promised dance." He was determined to get it right. Not long thereafter, Elizabeth stood across from Mr. Darcy at the far end of the room, where even more couples had assembled, now that her sister Mary had given a more proficient young lady a turn on the pianoforte. Was it any wonder that her heart was thumping against her chest? Who among those gathered there did not know about Mr. Darcy's callous remark some weeks ago at the Meryton assembly? Standing with his friend, Charles Bingley, he had complained that Elizabeth was tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt him, when Bingley urged him to request Elizabeth's hand for a set. Indeed, Elizabeth had been but a few feet away from him when he uttered those infamous words. She had chosen not to confront him. Instead, she did her part to make certain everyone knew what he had done. Whether she had told of his callousness in an attempt to call into question his character or to assuage her wounded vanity, she could not say. All she knew was she was now standing across from the proud man and reading in her neighbours' looks their amazement in beholding her doing so. Darcy and Elizabeth soon began to go down the dance in silence. "I may have to dance with him, but I surely do not have to converse with him." Still, she did not tear her eyes away from him. "Such a handsome man, tall, fine countenance, good figure. He has so many of all the best parts of beauty in his favour. What a shame that he is proud and above his company. He is nothing at all like his friend Mr. Bingley. Bingley is kind and amiable, and, in consequence of his unabashed affection for my dearest sister Jane, he is everything akin to the best man in the world. Whereas Mr. Darcy, I'm sure I do not know what to make of him. He seems to look down at everyone only to find fault, and to judge them severely as a means of justifying his overblown sense of self-worth." For the longest time, Elizabeth and Darcy were in what she would describe as a contest of wills, neither willing to break the silence, nor likewise willing to be the first to break eye contact. However, he did look away. Thinly disguised disgust soon covered his countenance. Intrigued by the deeper shade of hauteur overspreading his features, Elizabeth's curiosity as to what had distracted the proud man overtook her, and she turned her head in the direction in which he glared. A surge of embarrassment flooded her being. Her youngest sister Lydia could not make herself more ridiculous even if she commenced dancing on the ceiling. A stout, well-grown girl of 15, with a fine complexion and good-humoured countenance, the youngest Bennet daughter was laughing and bobbing her head and making a concerted effort to entertain the crowd of redcoats gathered around her. If Elizabeth did not know better, she would swear her sister was in her cups. Not to be denied her part in the appalling exhibition, Elizabeth's younger sister Kitty eagerly applauded Lydia's antics. All this was in the wake of her sister Mary's impatient display on the pianoforte that had garnered a rather unflattering reception from the partygoers. Elizabeth did not know whether to be embarrassed for her sister, angry with herself for just having argued with Mr. Darcy for his disparaging remarks about her family, or angry that he might have fodder to pick up where they had left off earlier. "You might as well remark on my sister's behaviour, Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth said, her voice measured. "Clearly, you have not the capacity to refrain from making your feelings known." Part 3. Undeniably Real. "Miss Elizabeth, I'm afraid I have left you with a very unfavourable opinion of my character." They were parted by the dance, leaving Elizabeth to wonder what his next statement might be. If I did not know better, I would say his tone bore an uncharacteristic measure of contrition. When the dance joined them once more, he said, "It is not for me to condemn the behaviour of your sister. I, too, have a younger sister whose choices for herself are opposite those I would make for her. I would not wish to have anyone speak ill of Georgiana, regardless of the situation. You are quite safe from me," he said, before they separated again. His startled speech now having dawned upon her, Elizabeth turned her head sharply and almost missed a step. Can this be Mr. Darcy? The mere suggestion that his sister was less than the epitome of perfection coming from his lips was unfathomable. To hear Miss Bingley speak, one would imagine Miss Darcy personifies everything an accomplished young woman ought to be. Did Mr. Darcy really compare his sister to my sister Lydia? A most alarming sense of unease swept over him. I cannot believe I am telling her this. But if I'm to be honest with myself, I would have to admit that while what her sister is doing is bad form, it is nothing in comparison to the scandal that my own sister was about to commit in eloping with that wretched scoundrel, George Wickham. Darcy truly abhorred that man, even though they had once been close friends. That was many years ago. He had since observed the vicious propensities and the want of principle that made the scoundrel wholly unsuitable for the living in Kempton that Darcy's late father, Wickham's godfather, had intended for him. Wickham had come to Darcy, requesting money in lieu of the living, and Darcy had obliged him. However, Wickham's greed got the better of him, and he demanded even more money from Darcy. When Darcy did not comply, Wickham sought to marry young Georgiana Darcy in the hope that he would control her dowry of £30,000. Fortunately, Darcy had arrived in Ramsgate in time to thwart Wickham's reprehensible scheme. A day later, and my family's shame would be greater than would anything, so great that it would pale in comparison to a young girl making a spectacle of herself with the local officers, while safely surrounded by family and friends. Georgiana had not been the first young woman to fall prey to George Wickham's charms, nor would she be the last, Darcy considered, even as he wondered if a woman like Miss Elizabeth might be deceived by the likes of Wickham as well. Surely a woman as astute as Miss Elizabeth, whom he suspected made sport of laughing at the absurdity of others, would discern Wickham's ilk from miles away. On the off chance that she might not, I pray their paths will never cross. Mr. Darcy said, "Indeed, I may have said things that were inappropriate, but your reasoned admonishment has forced me to look at myself and examine my motives as well as the workings of my heart." Their hands joined in the dance, and what she earlier perceived as his cold and unfeeling grip now seemed akin to a warm and familiar touch. What an odd notion that a man so aloof and foreboding could engender in her such varying feelings as to puzzle her as exceedingly as this. "The fact is, I find myself wanting to be a better man, wanting to make amends for every ridiculous word I've ever uttered in your presence." What on earth is he about? As they had by now come to the end of the dance, she would never know. She curtsied and was about to turn and walk away. His voice, unsteady yet determined, caught her by surprise. "Miss Elizabeth, may I have a word with you?" "Sir, you asked me to dance, and I had no choice but to oblige. Why, pray tell, would I wish to speak with you any longer?" "Please, just a moment of your time is all I require." In the wake of his earlier declarations, Elizabeth's curiosity simply would not be repressed. She accepted his invitation, and taking proper care to assure that their going outside together met with no one's notice, they proceeded in opposite directions, and soon met again on the terrace. Standing a few feet away from him, Elizabeth observed Darcy looking up at the moon, as if therein lay the mystery of his baffling character. Although the balmy night air afforded a perfectly pleasant evening, she wrapped her arms around her shoulders. "I'm waiting, sir." With tentative strides, Darcy closed much of the distance between them. He reached out to her, and then his hand fell just short of touching her. "The fact is, Miss Elizabeth, I admire you." Feelings akin to astonishment washed over her. "You admire me, Mr. Darcy?" "Indeed. You were right to call me out for my callous remark this evening. I've come to expect nothing less from you. In truth, I have never been more taken by any woman as I have with you. Everyone should be so fortunate to have someone like you in his or her corner, someone who is loving, caring, compassionate. I, for one, would be a better man." Amazed by his avowal, she knew not what to say. Thus she said nothing. Her silence seemed to encourage him, and he went on to say he could not help but feel drawn to her for her kind-heartedness. Even her fierce loyalty to her family bore a testament to her goodness. Once again, she found herself asking what had happened to Mr. Darcy. "Sir, I know you well enough to know there is an insult awaiting your next breath, or perhaps buried within your words, but I find myself quite incapable of discerning what it is." "That's because there is no insult intended. I mean every word I'm saying to you. I find myself wanting to earn your good opinion, wanting to know you better." Elizabeth was not immune to a gentleman who confessed his weaknesses openly, and in so doing flattered her ego as well as he just did. Perhaps she had better give him a second chance. Mr. Darcy is Mr. Bingley's closest friend, after all, a commendation that must surely count for something. To give him this chance is to risk nothing. To deny him this chance is to risk forever wondering what might have been. They had gotten off to the wrong start, she quickly reasoned. Is it fair to fault him for expressing aloud many of the sentiments that, in my heart, I have long known to be true? He has voiced his heartfelt regret and his intention of being a better man. Am I then not obliged to give him a chance to match his words with his deeds? Just as the clouds completed their waltz across the bright full moon, Darcy sensed a turning point in the evening. "I've longed for an occasion such as this. Do I dare open my mouth and risk ruining what has heretofore been the best moment we have ever spent in each other's company?" His mind raced through the litany of things he might say next. Shall I speak of poetry, of books, of the places she has travelled? No, he had far weightier matters he wished to discuss. Perhaps I might explain that I was taught to be selfish and overbearing, to care for none beyond my own family circle, and to think meanly of others, of their sense and worth compared to my own. Then I might confess my growing esteem for her in spite of her low connections and her family's lack of fortune. Darcy bit his lower lip. No, that would never do, for I might ruin every chance of discovering if the tender regard I feel for her is the basis for something lasting. We were speaking of her family. Do I attempt to say something in that regard? Apologize once again for my badly spoken remark? Shall I speak of my own family and how foolish they would think me were they to learn of my budding feelings for her? The fact was that he'd never seen anyone like her. He'd never known anybody like her. Finally, he had met a woman he found himself contemplating introducing to his sister, welcoming to his beloved Pemberley as his wife. What if, in explaining the reasons I have fought against showing her the special regard she arouses in me, I should say something that she deems lacking in sensibility, or worse, stupid? I might never know whether she indeed might be the one I've been waiting for, longing for. Darcy did not dare risk denying himself this chance. At such a tender moment as this, perhaps it is better to say nothing at all. Might she then regard me as inconstant? It would not do. Say something, man. He closed the last bit of distance between them. May I call upon you at Longbourn tomorrow? Her eyes brightened, filling him with hope. She lifted her hand. Taking it in his, he turned it over and pressed a kiss on her palm. Gasping softly, she closed her hand. With a pleasing hint of a smile that took his breath away, she gazed up at him. Yes, you may. She said yes. She said the word he longed to hear. Yes. Whether this was indeed the start of something wonderful and lasting between them, all due time would tell. One thing he knew with certainty, the look in her eyes held the promise of the pleasures that awaited him in finding out. This has been A Tender Moment, a Darcy and Elizabeth short story. Darcy and Elizabeth Short Stories, Book 3. Written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Pearl Hewitt. Copyright 2014-2015 by P.O. Dixon. Production copyright 2015 by P.O. Dixon.